Hello, and welcome to Doing Things Differently, effective approaches to boosting mobility and curtailing gentrification and displacement among low income communities of color. I am Janai Nelson, LDF's President and Director-Counsel, and this is part two of our webinar series exploring ways to strengthen communities of color through local government policies and practices. LDF's Thurgood Marshall Institute is so pleased to be hosting this important conversation at a critical moment in this country's fight for fair housing and equal access. Where we live impacts every aspect of our lives. As- Access to good jobs, good schools, public transportation, and safe streets. Everyone deserves a home and a safe community with the resources necessary to thrive. LDF has worked for more than 80 years to eliminate barriers to housing and promote opportunity. As our nation becomes more diverse, racially, ethnically, linguistically, and in a multitude of identities, we need to foster stronger and more inclusive communities because they are critical to our collective success and prosperity, and they are a matter of justice. Because of legal and extra legal housing discrimination, Black Americans exist in a dual housing market. As a result, they pay a higher proportion of their income than other groups for housing of lower quality. And while it's true that cost burdens affect households of all races and ethnicities, the data show that Black and Latinx renters are much more likely to be burdened than white renters. For example, nearly 20% of Black people never own a home, compared to only 2% of non Hispanic whites who can say the same. The historic process of redlining ensured that the Black people who were forced to reside in overcrowded Black urban neighborhoods could not receive the financial investments they needed to maintain their homes and businesses. Most of the neighborhoods redlined over 80 years ago still remain racially segregated neighborhoods with low to moderate income. Even when Black people can secure a mortgage loan and purchase a home, they will still have a harder time building wealth through home ownership. Here is a case in point. A 2018 study from the Brookings Institution shows that homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods are appraised for 23% less than similar homes in predominantly white neighborhoods. The ugly truth is that practices such as underappraisal of home values in Black neighborhoods, the creation of misleading credit scoring models, and unfair mortgage lending continue to limit Black home ownership and Latinx home ownership. We have created a system where your zip code can determine your quality of life and even predict how long you will live. Let me emphasize that again. Up to 60% of your health is determined by your zip code. Black and Latinx residents who live in highly segregated and isolated neighborhoods have lower housing quality, higher concentrations of poverty, and less access to good jobs, education, and quality health care. Black and Hispanic persons living in segregated neighborhoods have lower incomes, lower levels of education, lower rates of health insurance, and more limited access to doctors than those in less segregated neighborhoods. And not only are many Black Americans locked out of housing in high opportunity communities, many also find themselves displaced from long term Black communities once the neighborhood experiences substantial investments associated with gentrification. Many of the formerly redlined neighborhoods that are no longer majority minority communities have been gentrified. But while gentrification is associated with greater economic change and higher levels of interaction between Black and white residents, it also produces greater economic inequality and displacement. A new study by a Stanford sociologist shows that the negative effects of gentrification are felt disproportionately by Black and Latinx residents who often have fewer options of neighborhoods they can move to compared to their white counterparts. We have an opportunity to address long-standing racial inequalities and support the advancement of individuals and communities previously excluded from the American dream. We must learn from our past, and we must be strategic in crafting policy solutions and government practices that center racial equity. I am eager to learn from the collective wisdom of the panelists today on how best to rise to this challenge. And today's panel is moderated by our Thurgood Marshall Institute Senior Research Fellow, Julian Castro, who collaborates with LDF staff on projects relating to boosting economic mobility and quality of life for communities of color. His experience as a city council member and as mayor of San Antonio, the largest city in Texas, brings a valuable perspective to our thinking about local housing policy and advocacy. His time as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where under his leadership, HUD rolled out an affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation that advocates and local jurisdictions have been urging HUD to issue for decades, is another important lens for this discussion. Secretary Castro's unique personal and professional background provide insight into the relationship between advocates and government officials in promoting the economic development of low-income communities. Today's timely conversation on how to boost mobility for low-income communities of color, the impact of gentrification, and the phenomenon of displacement has a superb guide in Secretary Castro. We are grateful for his leadership in producing this webinar. We thank you and look forward to meeting your panel, Secretary Castro.
Thank you so much, Janai, for that wonderful introduction and fantastic way to frame our conversation today. I also want to thank you for your terrific leadership of the NAACP LDF. Today, we have a fascinating conversation about something that American communities have been grappling with for decades now, if not longer, that relates to several other dynamics. We're going to be talking about gentrification and displacement. We have, I think, today a conversation about one of the most hot button issues that presents itself in cities big and small across this country. When I was HUD secretary, I had the chance to visit over 100 different communities. And of those communities, I saw neighborhoods, longstanding neighborhoods of color, neighborhoods where generations of Black families had lived that were suddenly changing. And the more that I looked into the history of this in different neighborhoods, the more I could tell that it wasn't unique to one community in the country, to one geography in our country, that it was going on all over the place. I also knew that one of the common aspirations of some families who live in neighborhoods like the one that I grew up on the west side of San Antonio was to try and seek opportunity in another neighborhood, in other words, to gain mobility. And I started to think about sometimes the way that these dynamics relate to each other, the conflict, the tension, the way that we can help achieve two things for communities of color, low-income communities, both the ability to move to an area that they see as a higher opportunity area if they choose to do that, but also the ability to stay in place in a neighborhood where we're able to boost up the schools, boost up the quality of life, connect that to economic opportunity, better health outcomes, and so forth. And so the conversation that we're having today is a mouthful. It's called Doing Things Differently, Effective Approaches to Boosting Mobility and Curtailing Gentrification and Displacement Among Low-Income Communities of Color. But what we're really going to get at are how policymakers in local communities across this country should be thinking about striking all of these balances. And to do that, we have a fantastic panel today that I want to quickly introduce. Our first panelist is Lisa Bates, who is a professor at Portland State University in the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning. She's also a Portland professor in innovative housing policy, and she's affiliated with Portland State University's Black Studies Department. I'm particularly excited to hear from Professor Bates because she's done excellent work looking at urban dynamics on housing and gentrification and displacement in the city of Portland, and has had the opportunity also to understand how the interplay of those dynamics actually affects people's lives. Welcome, Professor Bates. Our second panelist is someone whom I'm familiar with in my hometown, Councilwoman Teri Castillo. Councilwoman Castillo is in her first term representing District 5, which is on the west side of San Antonio, about 130,000 residents. She sits on the City Council's Planning and Development Committee. And during her tenure, she has been, I think it's fair to say, the most vocal council member that San Antonio has seen in decades when it comes to trying to push back against the gentrification and displacement that is currently happening on the largely Mexican-American west side of San Antonio. Welcome, Councilwoman Castillo. Our third panelist is Kamau Franklin. Kamau is the founder of Community Movement Builders in Atlanta. He has been an activist first in New York City and now in Atlanta for more than 30 years. He started off as an attorney in New York City and has been active leading a movement there in Atlanta to strike the balance that I spoke of, to push back against gentrification and displacement, to give folks options, and also to ensure that there's more housing opportunity in low-income neighborhoods, long-standing communities of color in Atlanta that need it. Kamau, thank you so much for joining us. And our fourth panelist is Imani Keith Henry, who is the founder of Equality for Flatbush. Imani has led that organization since 2013. He's a longtime activist that has pushed on issues not only around affordable housing and gentrification and displacement, but also police accountability. And I'm pleased to welcome him to the panel as well. Imani, thank you for being here. So I want to start off by just giving our audience a sense of what's happening in each of the communities that you are either active in, or in the case of Councilwoman Castillo, you represent, or in the case of Professor Bates, the community that your research has been most focused on. And Professor, I want to start with you. Give us a sense of what's happening in Portland when it comes to gentrification and displacement, and a little bit about the history of that, where we are, and then where we are today with it.
Well, Portland is a place that I think a lot of people see as a unique and strange kind of keep Portland weird city. But in fact, Portland is much like a lot of mid-sized cities around the country. It has a history of using urban renewal and other policy tools to clear and displace communities of color, the historically Black communities in the central part of Portland. And now, because it is a fun and exciting place to live and lots of folks who move here every year, it's becoming unaffordable and it's becoming difficult to stay in central neighborhoods that are places of high levels of access to jobs, parks, fresh food, tree canopy, all the things we think of as good neighborhoods. And communities of color have increasingly been pushed out into outer edges of the city, into the suburbs, or even out of the metro area by growing unaffordability. At the same time, there's been a really robust community response and coalition building to try to get the city of Portland and our regional government to address this kind of metropolitan restructuring, to address housing affordability and access, but also to really pay attention to these places, these historical neighborhoods that are now very amenity rich, and making sure that people continue to have access to those places.
And now Portland, when most folks think about the city and when they think about the state of Oregon, they think about an overwhelmingly white community there. Portland, as I understand it, is about 6% Black, and also, of course, has other communities of color there. Could you talk about what that looks like geographically in Portland, and how has that impacted the investments that have been made or not made over time in the community?
Portland is about 6% Black, and historically, nearly all the Black folks in the state of Oregon not only lived in the city of Portland, but lived in one sort of cluster of neighborhoods called the Albina community. That area has been repeatedly historically subject to urban renewal. It's the building of convention centers, stadium, I-5, the freeway goes through the neighborhood. So there's intergenerational displacement that has happened due to government actions. More recently, in the past 20 years, a new kind of version of urban renewal was declared, and the area tax increment financing district was created, and really prompted a huge amount of private investment, public-private partnership investment into these neighborhoods that have pushed out tens of thousands of Black folks who now live further out into East Portland, into the east suburbs, or have even left the state or left the metro area because of unaffordability. And there's been a tremendous amount of pushback, demands for affordable housing inclusion, for maintaining the cultural community, many of the institutions, and the city of Portland has created a community preference policy that actually recognizes the city's role in pushing people out over multiple generations, that lets people have access to housing in the historic Albina area now. It's not a reversal of gentrification, but it has been an acknowledgement of the particular historical wrongs that have been done to the Black community here. And I think that that's important.
Kamau, what about Atlanta? You've been working in the community for a number of years, pushing back against gentrification and displacement. What's happening right now in Atlanta?
I think in Atlanta, what we have is something similar that I'm sure all the panelists will talk about, is basically an exodus of working class and poor Black and brown people from metropolitan areas and being pushed to suburban areas or outlier areas, and where they have to live. I think the uniqueness of Atlanta is that Atlanta claims that it's not only a Black Mecca, but a city too busy to hate, where in reality, it is the Black elected officials who have been Democrats. We should point that out, that this is not an issue of party. This is an issue of policy, and this is an issue of what these politicians are responding to. And so in Atlanta, you've had elected officials who've been a Black-led city for upwards of 40 or 50 years, which have led the way for gentrification to happen. And that's important because we can't talk about this issue of gentrification like it's an accident, like these folks didn't see it coming. These folks participated completely in the idea that stripping a city of its working class and poor citizens was the way to go to make room for luxury apartments, for tech companies, for high rises, and making sure that those more well-established, let's say, workers who have bigger incomes can find places to live. And so in Atlanta, you've had basically from the northern part of Atlanta now down to the southern part, which is probably the last where there are probably the last intact Black communities in Southwest Atlanta, where we do most of our work, who have slowly been pushed out because the all public housing has been knocked down and destroyed and closed. And instead vouchers have been given. And again, we have to remember, like when vouchers are given, those vouchers are for the landlords to decide whether or not they're going to accept or not. And so you have that dilemma that's happened. You've had real estate development in a sense that big corporations have securitized rental housing and bought literally thousands of units of rental housing where they could securitize the rents the way they were doing mortgages a decade or so ago, which again has led to people being pushed out. And it's just the commodification of housing that continues to happen in a city like Atlanta, where the population, again, in what's called the Black Mecca, has gone from 60% Black to now in the latest census below 50% for the first time in probably 60 or 70 years. So it's really destroying and breaking up communities. People are struggling to make ends meet in terms of staying and living in Atlanta. But for the most part, people are losing that struggle because capital and corporations in the real estate market, along with the elected officials, have created a powerful coalition, let's say, which is out to take Atlanta from the type of city it was to a city that's more akin to a San Francisco in terms of how its housing patterns operate.
I want to jump to you, Councilwoman Castillo, to talk about the west side of San Antonio. Obviously near and dear to my heart, grew up there, represented the San Antonio part of it as city councilman and then eventually as mayor. And we have seen over the last 15, 20 years, considerable gentrification and growing displacement on the west side. You have been very vocal about that, and you've found a good number of allies in the community. What's going on in San Antonio as you see it?
San Antonio is experiencing economic investment, predatory real estate practices that are outpacing stagnant wages and policy protection for renters and property owners. So what that looks like for the West Side, which is our city, and if not the state's most economically poor city council district and zip code with a roughly $13,000 per capita income, is we are at risk of mass displacement, right? And what that means is District 5 and the West Side in particular is very unique in that we have the majority of the city's public housing stock. And as other panelists have touched on, ensuring that we protect that public housing will help us, one, ensure that we keep families housed, and two, we know that if we demolish and rebuild as mixed income, we lose that affordability forever. Like many public housing authorities throughout the nation, there's roughly 80,000 family waiting lists, the majority of which are children, to access public housing, to access vouchers. So if we remove that public housing stock, we will be perpetuating the housing crisis locally, right? So what that takes is coalition building and ensuring that we're working with the elected officials throughout San Antonio to ensure that we're securing funding for public housing. And we've been working with a congressman in particular to secure funding for our public housing, right? And oftentimes what I get is resistance, right? Public housing is federal. Why are you advocating for that? One, we're not going to address the housing crisis on a zip code or a district by district approach. We need to work together to ensure that we're protecting that housing affordability in general. But like other cities, right, District 5 and the West Side in particular have a history of displacement when it comes to urban renewal and the construction of highways. And what we're now seeing is tools refashioned under the guise of progress that are facilitating displacement. And what that looks like in San Antonio and now in District 5 is what a UT Austin study found is that the city of San Antonio is issuing more notices to vacate and demolition permits than any other city in Texas, right? And this pattern of demolitions and notices to vacate follow the economic development pattern. And again, right, if we look to the Atlanta Beltline or the Chicago 606 line, many of these economic development projects have intended consequences. I say intended because there's a history and patterns that we study and we know better. And if we don't do better, it's intentional. So looking at these patterns, we're seeing the demolitions follow these patterns of economic development. And I want to be sure that I highlight, right, these patterns and this displacement has always been met with community resistance, right? It's not a phenomenon that just occurs, and it's not a phenomenon that just occurs without community input and resistance. There's always been communities organizing and pushing back, raising the red flag. For example, the UT Austin study, community had gathered the same data and had come to city leaders saying, hey, there's something going on here. But that study corroborates what community had been experiencing. And that's what we're seeing now play out. But again, we're pushing back, and we've implemented a demolition mitigation pilot program to connect those families to resources to rehab their home rather than losing their most valuable asset, their property.
Thank you, Councilwoman Castillo. I look forward to a conversation about some of the specific policies that communities are pursuing to address these issues. But we also want to hear from Imani Henry. Imani, you've been doing work with Equality for Flatbush in the Flatbush and Crown Heights area of Brooklyn. When people think about communities that have dealt with gentrification and displacement in spades, they think about the New York area. But you are much more aware of the nuance of that. So tell us about sort of what's going on right now.
Well, thank you. I would say, in general, and I want to talk more citywide because I think that's the piece of it. Our work is Brooklyn-wide. We're based in Flatbush, East Flatbush, and Crown Heights, specifically around police accountability work. We're the accountability group in that neighborhood. But a lot of the patterns that we see are impacting neighborhoods all across New York. So, for instance, a lot of times we talk about gentrification in New York City. There's an argument of whether it's been 50 to 70 years in the making, but depending on what neighborhood, if you're in Harlem, if you're in Manhattan, Chinatown, you can talk about gentrification over the last 15, 20 years. When we get to some place like Brooklyn, which again is known at this point as one of the most expensive places to live in the country, the piece that we have been able to sort of pinpoint is one, the building, similar to other communities of the Barclays Center, which helped to demolish and start impacting communities near downtown Brooklyn. So that is Bedford-Stuyvesant, Park Slope, Prospect Heights, all these different neighborhoods that have been like highly residential neighborhoods that we're seeing a lot of, particularly homeowners, tenants going through, higher rents, higher mortgages, mortgage schemes, debt fraud, all of this. We would say that particularly for New York City in 2016 is when the mayor's housing plan came into being. The entire housing movement, and in fact, the community boards, like 80% of the community boards were against and tried to veto, this plan that was based in development, specifically around rezoning neighborhoods, and as well as building luxury with this fake understanding of affordability, what we call MHH housing. Again, so we're talking about what is affordability when you have to make $60,000 a year for a studio apartment that's going to cost you close to $2,000, or that you need to make $90,000 a year to just get a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom in Brooklyn at this point. So in 2016, because the community boards still don't have veto power, they have just advisory power. The mayor was able to push through this plan. And in New York City, again, similar to Atlanta and lots of other places, though our city council is majority Black and brown, these were folks, we want to just sort of say, like, from the old school network that have had 2-3 terms that were very pro-development, very pro. In fact, even the mayor of New York City now was the Brooklyn Borough president, who's always been very pro-gentrification, gave tours to, developers of downtown Brooklyn, etc. So, what we have seen and what we talk about, the distinction between, like, say, white flight, the distinction between people being able to voluntarily move to other neighborhoods, we see permanent displacement. That's what's happening. This is what this new sort of period is for folks in New York City and Brooklyn particularly, about permanent displacements from historically Black and brown communities, low to middle income communities. So that's, the plight. And that could look, in so many different ways for so many different people. That could be about your landlord, like, not giving you any repairs. I want to be clear, we've always had a housing struggle. We've always been fighting for affordability. We've always been fighting, against police violence. But all of these things have escalated, as many studies have shown that highly rapidly gentrified neighborhoods have a higher police presence, have a higher rate. So, for instance, in the communities that we do police accountability work, we have had about 8 people murdered by the NYPD since 2012. And that's just in our little portion of Brooklyn. We don't, tuck along the Bronx and elsewhere. There's just higher and higher rates of police murder that is more public and happening.
That is important. So one of the things that we're hoping to get out of this conversation is really a focus on solutions for the benefit of policymakers and advocates in other communities that are doing important work or want to do important work on this space. And so, yeah, I want to just start off by asking you, Kamau, and then open this up just briefly to all of the other panelists. When it comes to both boosting mobility and then also combating gentrification and displacement, what are the best policies that local communities should be considering to address gentrification and displacement? What have you seen that worked or maybe definitely didn't work, if you want to, add a note of caution to communities out there, and why was it effective?
The best thing that can help prevent gentrification is an organized community. And so creating organizations of poor and working class people, whether or not those are tenant unions, whether or not those are community-based organizations that really fight back against the development class on what's best for community needs. And so sometimes you have people who, again, because the idea is that a lot of elected officials, there are obviously some who work on behalf of working class and poor people, but just too many times people are so heavily influenced by the resources and the money of corporate power and real estate power that even those who say they're on your side, when it comes down to it, as Imani was pointing out, they become very pro-development really fast. But to get to some policy angles that I think are worth exploring, at least some of the ones that I think that cities don't do enough of, is one around land trust. So the idea that decommodifying housing and putting them in land trusts where basically the land underneath is owned in commons, as said, and then you only the property itself, the building itself, or the structure itself is for sale, and they can come with certain restrictions around income levels who can purchase. Still usually the biggest owner of land in these cities are the cities themselves. And a lot of cities take to selling property on courthouse steps for tax sales to the highest bidder, as opposed to thinking about land trust. The other is having all city-owned property that gets developed, particularly for residential use, do so with the AMI at its top level, I think about 30%, or whatever the medium income of the current community is, or making sure that it's less than 30% of the income of anyone who is applying for housing. Making sure that those are the folks, if you're going to use outside development, that get the tax breaks, so that development can be prioritized, particularly by city-owned property. I would say increasing taxes on corporations and developments that are luxury developments, even mixed use developments, and using those resources to strictly increase the amount of working class housing or affordable housing that's built, having stronger protections for tenants in different communities, so that landlords cannot just on a whim break leases or throw folks out. That there must be stronger protection, including having access to defense attorneys for tenants that are appointed for when they go into court. So I think some of those are the basics of what I think are decent policies to begin fighting back this trend. That if elected officials had a seriousness to them in terms of wanting to really fight against gentrification, that they would think really hard about fighting back against the development and corporate class, which really get to control how housing happens in major metropolitan areas.
panelists, if you want to weigh in.
Having community benefits agreements, which absolutely should happen with any kind of public land disposition, but also can happen with any kind of private development, because all private development requires the public sector to regulate and permit. So there's an opportunity to engage and negotiate and make demands in these significant private developments for community benefits, be those inclusionary housing, job and work requirements, other kinds of mitigation of harms to the community that may happen, and that those need to be rooted in community power and accountability. Speaking from a kind of one of these progressive West Coast cities, it is really important. The most high impact and lasting kinds of community benefits negotiations are rooted in community organizing for power, not in persuading well-meaning politicians or bureaucrats. Policies are incredibly important, and a policy framework that allows for things like tenant opportunity to purchase when their rental buildings are sold, that create tenant protection policies that require equity impacts reviews and mitigation are critical, but they have to be rooted in, there has to be a root in community organizing to hold folks accountable to those kinds of policies. So that organizing piece, I really echo and strongly see that in what we can see around the West Coast in terms of where communities are really able to have an impact.
We have unlimited need, but limited public dollars, right? Or so it's argued. And as alluded to, what our philosophy here in District 5 is that public dollars should go towards public good. And if we are using public dollars to finance the construction of any new development, it must meet the affordability goals of the city's strategic housing implementation plan, which is a guiding document that our city council recently passed, right? But ensuring that we stick to those principles and are intentional with those public dollars to where we're meeting the need. What we've found, right, and again, this is something that community had brought forward, is that we were overproducing city and incentivized market rate housing. So now it's shifting back to the 30% AMI. However, as mentioned, right, we all know that the real estate industry is extremely powerful. However, winning things like a tenant's bill of rights in San Antonio, winning things like rent control in Seattle, these things are possible despite state preemption, but it takes building community and coalition building to win these things, right? They are possible in red states, in red cities, but it does take communities coming together to fight for that goal. Ultimately, right, I think as a state, as a nation, we should explore absentee landlords tax or a land speculation tax. Folks who are further commodifying the land and housing in the west side of San Antonio and are, are waiting to cash in, right? While we have a waiting list of folks trying to get into public housing. The city of San Antonio currently has programs that exist to help homeowners, but are extremely underfunded, such as a minor rehab, home rehab. So it helps bring low-income families, bring their homes up to code, and they're less vulnerable to those predatory real estate practices. But what we have is more need than we have funding for these slots. So this is definitely an ask that we've been pushing for. But again, right, that's together with community, not alone as an office. And I know Senator Nicole Saval just won a whole homes repair, which is a large-scale homeowner rehab program. And while that's in the East Coast, right, we have an opportunity to replicate those things here.
Okay, so Professor Bates, we've talked a lot about gentrification and displacement. The other end of that is the idea of boosting mobility. In 2015, researcher Raj Chetty came out with groundbreaking research that was based on a longitudinal analysis of families that had been given vouchers, and his research determined that there were benefits to moving to what they labeled higher opportunity areas. Obviously, there's some back and forth about how you would define that. Should they be defined in that way? But to the extent that families who are growing up in a longstanding community of color that oftentimes oftentimes has been underinvested in, neglected, wants to move to another area. How do you think about striking that balance between boosting mobility and then also, investing in and protecting and improving communities that really have not gotten a fair shake ever, have been neglected and not received the attention that they deserve? And there's so many of them out there. What have you seen based on your research?
One thing that's really important is that we can't conceptualize these two questions as separate, and they're often posed in this way of it's one thing is happening or the other thing is happening. Our metropolitan areas and neighborhoods are all interconnected. And so if we imagine that we are moving away from so-called concentrated poverty to somewhere else, that other place is also connected. So what we've seen in the past, 30 or 40 years is an almost total restructuring in many metropolitan areas of where this geography of opportunity even exists. And what I see when I look at the research of Dr. Chetty and others is that the primary opportunity structure is the accumulated privilege of whiteness. And opportunity moves with the folks who have historically accumulated privilege, resources, and access. So, and race in a far greater way determines people's outcomes, whether they've stayed in the old neighborhood or moved to the so-called high opportunity neighborhood. In the research over and over again, being Black, being Latina, has a far greater impact in terms of life outcomes. Access to opportunity is not just being near things. Access is a verb, and it requires people to be able to actually make connections to material and political resources wherever they are. And so I think it's actually incredibly important to not place these two activities of mobility and being in place as though they are in conflict with one another. The thing that we've never really tried historically is actually providing the kinds of material resources that people of color in their communities have asked for. Whether they want to stay, among a historical and cultural community, or they prefer to move to some other geographic area, that we haven't really tried that yet as a policy. But I do think that, speaking from a policy perspective, the framework around affirmatively furthering fair housing makes it clear that fair housing isn't only opening up neighborhoods that are predominantly white. It is also ensuring that people are resourced and that community development takes place in all locations. But I think we need to really recognize that displacement is very harmful for people, and mobility has had limited positive impacts for people of color. So I think that actually breaking out of that paradigm to explore some of the kinds of policies and systematic changes that the other panelists are talking about in terms of community ownership and community control, decommodification, that's the avenue that we haven't really tried historically, and where I think the most promise lies in terms of giving people real opportunities to thrive.
Well, I think you make a powerful point about what the research bears out in terms of the headwinds that Black Americans face, or other individuals of color, even if they live in a so-called higher opportunity area. And we've seen the research comparing a white American who has only a high school education with a Black American who has a postgraduate degree, and how powerful a statement that makes. And so the importance of really paying attention to and investing in people and not just paying attention to place. If other panelists want to weigh in on that, feel free. Imani?
I think that's a very excellent analysis because, Brooklyn, New York itself is full of, migrants of color. And so for a lot of our people, I was specifically talking about Brooklyn, and our base is largely Black and brown Caribbean people, like English, Creole speaking, Spanish speaking Caribbean people, and descendants of, migrants. And so for a community, Brooklyn wide, has been the highest concentration of Black people in, New York City, the second highest concentration of Haitian people in the United States. And a lot of people see that they've already moved to, for, whatever that, means for them, a land of opportunity. That people there, and we like to say that there is wealth in our community. Quality for Flatbush fights for enclaves. We organize the way of understanding that we have wealth, we have economic wealth, and that's what the predatory developers are coming after. That we see that particularly Black women, middle-aged Black women, are dealing with after they've paid their mortgage and everything, are dealing with adjacent property damage by developers that build next to them and purposely damage, their property, their infrastructure, in order to get the homeowner to sell their property to them. Or, that we see all of our cultural events as being, this is what the real estate is selling. Don't you want to live in the land of Biggie? Don't you want to be, near the Caribbean Day Parade? That's, do you want to be next to the botanical gardens? Like, our culture, the wealth of our communities are being sold, or the bargaining chip for folks to say, like, come on into Brooklyn. You can be around this. Come on into Harlem. You can be around this. So I think we talk a lot about the wealth in our community. It might not be necessarily economic wealth, but there's cultural wealth. And we think that's very powerful and very important. And we talk a lot about low to income Brooklynites because it really, that this is happening to small businesses. This is happening to tenants. NYCHA is our public housing that is low to middle income, residents, and really talk about that, because I think that, for so many people, that there was white flight and they took over their neighborhoods, where we weren't living, took it over, like, say 30 to 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and we built those neighborhoods up. And now they're now prime market real estate, and just really showing, that they're not just running over, poor people that, haven't built a culture, haven't built wealth, economic power in their communities. It might not look in conjunction to what white folks have built, but it is important to acknowledge our cultural, political, economic wealth that we do have in our neighborhoods, and that gentrification is helping to destroy that.
Anybody else?
I could add on really quickly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To pick up on the cultural point, it's the culture without the people. So they're glad to accept the culture as long as they can have the poor people moved out, or the working class Black folks move it out, or the police there for them to project some idea that they're going to keep these new residents safe. So, obviously, also being from New York originally, there's stories about drummers in Harlem who for decades literally would drum on Saturday mornings. No disturbance, people enjoyed it. But as soon as they built sort of a luxury condo near the park where the drumming took place, residents would complain, the new residents would complain, basically gentrifiers. The police would be called, and then this institution would be kicked out. But there might be a mural to remember that the drummers were once there. And so this cultural aspect of claiming and taking and being a part of something, but at the same time whisking away the very people who brought that culture to that community or to that neighborhood. And then also very quickly, this is obviously a question of power. Communities have no power to determine who gets to come in and develop in that community. And if communities don't have that power, if that power is all downtown, it's all in the real estate market, it's all with big corporations who are moving their companies to new places and promising jobs, jobs they don't deliver on because they're basically having their employees come with them, and those employees are now looking for a space at higher incomes. High income rates in those same communities that were working class and poor, then you have the displacement of working class and poor people throughout these communities. Obviously, everybody wants to be able to have fluidity in terms of moving to different places. But if we have no place in these central cities for people who make lower incomes to live, then what we are saying is that we're only prioritizing middle class, and we're only prioritizing the whims of corporate elite and a real estate elite over the needs of poor and working class people, particularly poor and working class Black people. And that's why this is really a question of power, not a question of neglect, not a question of people overlooking something, but a question of people having power and exercising it to the detriment of the folks who actually lived and built up those communities.
And Councilman Castillo?
What I hear in the argument to justify the demolition of our existing public housing stock in San Antonio is the need to deconcentrate poverty in one of the most economically segregated cities. However, right, we do not take into account how violent that is, and the use of demolition is progress for who, right? We're disrupting entire communities where our networks exist, right? So for example, we have public housing tenants that their great grandmother lives 3 blocks away, and that's the caretaker of their child when they go to work. And if you disrupt that system and you move them out to the outskirts of the city, that adds hours to their commute, that adds more bills for transportation. And ultimately, right, you have the perpetuation of poverty. And what we're seeing is demolition used as a tool for quote unquote progress, right? But what it's being used as a tool for slum clearance. And as a city, we had and still are using federal funding to essentially clear out quote unquote slums, right? And what that looked like in District 5 was a community development granted code compliance officer that was restricted to specific census tracts. And that census tract was our city's most economically poor city council, or our most economically poor census tract, rather. So what we saw was targeted code compliance violations that were leading to a pipeline of notices to vacate and demolition. So what we requested was to have a general funded code compliance officer so they're not restricted to a specific zip code. However, when we noticed the pattern of heavy concentration of code compliance violations and citations and demolitions, we were told that it's not targeted. However, when you look at the language, it's restricted to specific census tracts, which is targeting. So again, right, what we're seeing is a lot of these conversations about deconcentrating poverty, but whether you live in the poorest city council, if you live in the poorest zip code or in an affluent area, you're still poor, right? And what are we doing to tackle the root causes to provide economic upward mobility, right? And that's why it's important to recognize that whether you're in the fight for healthcare, in the fight for labor rights, that it's all interconnected. And we need to ensure that we're also advocating for livable wages at the same time that we're having this fight for housing justice. Because all these fights are intersecting, and we're going to need to work collaboratively to reach that goal. And there's no silver bullet, right? Capital is huge and it's a beast. And ultimately, right, it's about unveiling a lot of these tools that are being sold to community as this is good for you. We're going to beautify the area, but at the cost of who, right? Are you going to get to stay there to enjoy that area, or are we going to facilitate predatory real estate practices?
Yeah, we're going to move on to a conversation about advice and perspective that y'all have for elected officials and for advocates who are doing this work, want to do this work and be as effective as possible. But first, 2 quick questions to end our conversation in about solutions. And I'll stick with you, Councilwoman Castillo, and then just briefly ask if anybody else has a word to get in on this one. Is there a tension between the aspiration of integrating communities. And you all have spoken about this in different ways. I mean, the idea of the civil rights movement was that integration was a good thing. A tension between that and combating gentrification and displacement. In some ways, these neighborhoods that are getting gentrified, one could argue, are becoming more integrated. Address that for me. How do you think about that? And then I would welcome the other panelists to chime in as well.
I don't see it as a tension between integration and gentrification. I see it as a tension between predatory real estate practices and established working poor families, right? In what way are these corporate landlords and these entities, where are their prongs, right? And how are they accessing that land is the tension, right? Is it being facilitated through city practices, city policy, or federal dollars? Or, is this just something that we aren't resisting? So I don't see it as a tension between one or the other, because District 5 residents absolutely deserve to have their fair share of economic investment. District 5 residents deserve to have quality housing, right? But it shouldn't have to be one or the other. And I'd like to quickly point to the recent housing bond and city bond conversations, where District 5 was allocated roughly $50 million, and we ranked low for being the poorest city council district. But at the end of the day, with great debate, community organizing, and a lot of resistance and pushback, we secured 95.6 million rather, right? So we nearly doubled the amount, but that came with a lot of resistance, a lot of pushback, right? It shouldn't have to be where we have condos and lofts to get our drainage fixed. It shouldn't have to be that we have high-end condos to ensure that we have safe sidewalks and access to public transportation. So it shouldn't have to be one or the other. And it's important that we invest from the bottom up, not top down, meaning that our established communities have their material needs met, whether it's through drainage or emergency housing assistance, so on and so forth.
Other panelists that want to weigh in?
The civil rights movement was fighting for desegregation, not necessarily for integration. They wanted fair access to everything that anybody else had access to in terms of living in this country. And I think what we considered as the civil rights movement morphed into was a movement around power and who has control and access over resources for not only their community, but for their lives. So I think communities are much more interested and people are much more interested than in terms of whether or not folks live directly next to each other, but in having power over how resources are spent in the very communities that they live in, and who gets to decide what changes happen in those communities, at what pace they happen, and who do they benefit. I think that's a larger goal of what the movement came to see, was that poor and working class people, again, particularly poor and working class Black people, but other folks also needed to have power over resources in terms of what happened in their community. So I think, when we talk about gentrification, gentrification ultimately is not a plan of integration. It is a plan of displacement. It is a plan of ethnic cleansing. It's a plan to kick people out of the communities that they've lived in for literally decades, with all the problems in those communities, as has been mentioned. It's still a plan to kick those people out and replace them with wealthier, and for the most part, wealthier white residents with maybe little residues of what was left behind. But the idea is not that it's going to be a place where everyone lives peacefully and lovingly and in a beloved community, but it is actually a tactic to displace and move people out to get higher rents and higher mortgage payments and housing prices, to luxury amenities for people who already have wealth to move in.
Anybody else on that one?
The primary energy for those who care deeply about the Fair Housing Act, the spirit of fair housing and civil rights, ought to be not toward convincing communities of color who are trying to stay in place and make and build together where they are. The primary energy should be in addressing exclusionary white affluent communities who use law and policy to keep other people out. And there are many of them. They're in every city in America, every metropolitan area. There are pockets of concentrated white affluence who use law and policy to exclude others in violation of the Fair Housing Act. And I would suggest that that is the primary space to bring the energy of integration, if we really care about choices that people make.
I think the other piece that, is happening, is that we are experiencing, say, here in Brooklyn, is about redistricting all over again. That new like pockets of power being, pushed on existing communities. Sunset Park is one of the communities that, the assembly folks, the, council folks are working on fighting, because there are folks now they're saying, like, we want to redistrict this area. So there's now this voting block of like new, more affluent white folks. We see that there is exactly the same thing, that there is like, they want to destroy all kinds of public housing. We're not there yet on demolition, but yes, we have RAD that is, that is now a new policy where everyone is getting a voucher. I think the conversation has never been about integration. It's actually made the quality of life of Black and brown people worse. I mean, even something, the rise of hate crimes in our neighborhood. I mean, that Black people are being stabbed by fascists. 2 incidents happened 9 months apart in Flatbush. I mean, and the police don't see it as hate crimes. I think that's the other piece. What we're experiencing is that there's a hostility now to Black and brown people. We have, Mayor Adams, that his, in his beginning term is about, bashing in the heads of like homeless people, and raids. We have, his policies have been before anything about the safety of New Yorkers, but he's talking about new New Yorkers. So we have more and more police concentration in our neighborhoods. That's the other piece of it that I think is really important, that the policies, like, and the cause, the sort of the people's like quality of life has drastically changed in New York City if you are Black and brown, if you are people of color. And that's, the other part of gentrification, are policies that are actually hostile to the existing indigenous populations of people in the neighborhoods.
And just briefly, I mean, so what would success look like for you?
Yeah. We are a grassroots organizing group, and I would say that success looks like for us, we operate on a macro and micro level. So success has looked like, that we initiated the Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network so that we wouldn't have to fight community to community by ourselves. That, people of color led, I would say, in a more, more radically left position in the housing movement, intentionally, because then we have been able to take on, rezoning struggles, citywide struggles. We become like, the forces that, we have won and fought and defeated, the biggest housing, redistricting, I'm so sorry, the biggest, Industry City wanted to take over and rezone Sunset Park. We were able to defeat that. 4 years, 5 years of working together as a coalition, so that it's not just isolated to our people in Sunset Park. They wanted to build luxury towers over the Botanical Garden. Even the Botanical Garden in the beginning, activists, were more, outraged by this than the Botanical Garden itself. And it took folks in Crown Heights to fight and defeat these high-rise buildings that would initially just, destroy, the plant life there. There have been multiple struggles that have happened where community has pushed back. I mean, one of our things is that in the beginning in 2016, where everyone was tiptoeing, people were like even afraid to use the word gentrification. We developed a tactic where we just said, this is illegitimate. We're not asking for our neighborhoods to be rezoned. And we'd shut down those community board meetings. And we were able to like help and support struggles in East Harlem and Harlem, that people mass step together. And the way that Amazon, that 3-4 years before it even made the newspapers, Black and brown people, particularly Latinx and South Asian communities, were already fighting Amazon. and we're able to build a mass, action against Amazon and keep it from coming to New York City. So a success, for us, has always been the people on the ground fighting, to take back our communities, where our slogan is, before it's gone, take it back. This is ours. And but then on a micro level, we are the rapid response group. You can call us, on Thursday, because you got court on Wednesday, and we're going to find like a trusted lawyer to go to court with you. That we organize tenant associations, and we do go, we do go to court and take landlords to court, but we always have a shaming campaign. We, do lots of research, so we know our target well. It helps empower tenants to know that, the same, we were fighting a national landlord, Max Properties, that the tenants in Flatbush know that there's a, wrongful death case in Florida for the same issue of mold, excessive mold, and that we use and connect those struggles. So for us, it's like rapidly responding. We do eviction defense, and, maybe we can't keep the tenants there, right? But we, for 5 days, hold that space down. But then, for a year, we fight and then win hundreds of thousands of dollars for those tenants that were displaced. So that's what success looks like for us. Again, on a systemic level, of course, we are going to sign on to various policies, that, whether it be good cause evictions or etc. But in the meantime, we got to, be there for the day-to-day for our people. And in the meantime, we have to mass up together and fight together. And we've been able to have victories based on that.
I wanted to ask y'all, from the perspective that you have as a councilwoman, as a scholar, as longtime activist, to give advice to elected officials and advocates. What have y'all seen be most effective in terms of elected officials who want to address this issue, who have been addressing this issue? What's your advice for them? And then what's your advice with respect to advocates? And I'll start off with Professor Bates.
For advocates, what we've seen here in Portland, I'm going to describe a double-edged sword of a powerful strategy that also can have some pitfalls, which is to engage in some policy systems that appear at first to be sort of opaque, which is urban planning, land use planning, and development regulation systems. And I think, other panelists have described their work in those systems. And that's a space that is highly technical. There's a lot of law and policy there that can be very complicated on a legal level. But I think it is a space that's very important for addressing the main way that people get displaced, which is through private development. It's not really exclusively through public investment, although public investment and public-private partnerships are very important to what is happening in changing neighborhoods and gentrification. If you want to actually have a long-term impact on how development happens, you need to delve into those systems. At the same time, it's very wonky, it's very technical, and it's also important to not get so lost in the sauce there that we lose hold of a more visionary organizing. So I love that you asked the question of what's the vision for cities, because I think that the ability for advocates and organizers to describe what is it that we are talking about when we ask the question, who is the city for? Who is the city going to be for? One of the sort of central questions here in Portland and community has been, what would it look like if this city were built on loving Black people and loving Black communities the way that we do? And to ask people to imagine that and speak that into existence, and then connect that back to the kinds of advocacy moments that we have, has supported kind of the energy and the momentum and help folks to not get so lost in some of the technical details of the latest land use comprehensive plan, albeit a critical and important thing for us to work in as well.
How about Kamau? Advice for advocates, for elected officials, any experiences that stand out in your years of activism there?
If I start with advocates or organizers, it's base building. So the advice is always to be on the ground with the people who are most impacted by the results of gentrification, or who will soon be the most impacted. How do you organize communities to fight for power? And again, power and what a victory looks like is having poor and working class people able to live in cities in which they work, and as was spoken about earlier, where they have family connections, where the stores that they go to are nearby, where they know their friendship circle is nearby. That all leads to, of course, making sure that not only is it affordable for poor working class people, but making sure we have a society in which we try to do as much as possible to make sure poor working class people can have a decent wage, so that they will no longer always be at the bottom of the economic ladder. That there's opportunities from the gain more income, more resources, and so forth. But as that struggle is happening and the mutual struggle around housing is taking place, it's as having the power to determine what comes into a community. Is it good? Is it good for the residents in that community, or does it feel like it's about to push people out? And I think the idea for advocates and organizers is that you must start with the base building and working with people on the ground, so that not only they could not only be a part of a struggle, but they are the leading members of that struggle, right? And you're supporting them as they lead the way in fighting for basically are their rights. What I would tell elected officials and our politicians, we don't use this kind of language a lot in these friendly conversations around policy, but these are ideological questions. You have too many elected officials, again, who feel like they're on the right side of history, or they care about working class people, but they're so easily brought into the mechanics of sort of a corporate whim on how things get done. The idea that all development is good development, the idea that something shiny and new somehow is good for a community, even the idea that more green space, again, if appropriately thought through, somehow benefits communities, when communities may need other amenities before they get extended dog parks or other things, right? So I think some of these things are ideological questions that elected officials either come in to give the benefit of the doubt, naive about, or have basically decided that siding up with rich and corporate elite somehow means success for them, whether or not they speak in a progressive language or not. And so there are few and far elected officials that actually understand the role of capital in society to a degree where they're willing to challenge it. So ideological struggle is extremely important for elected officials who are not or will not act at the whim of corporate entities, but will instead base what they are doing in the needs of the regular people who usually voted them in the first place.
I think, we have been fighting and holding politicians accountable. I mean, part of our, just to be really honest, like a lot of times, struggles, the things that are happening in community, it's in the 11th hour, like saving a site of the Underground Railroad that's been a struggle for like 15 years, we're called in when they're about to like demolish something. In the same way happening with tenants, etc. So we've done a lot of work to sort of like really say to people that the people have the power, that we, are the folks that change, policy, that we, are the ones that influence politicians, and get them on the right side of history. Are you going to be down with the people, or are you not going to be down with the people? The thing that I will say is that we have had, over a decade of very, old school network politicians of color, as I already talked about. Only 5 folks voted against the mayor's housing plan, and 3 of them were like Black folks that have long histories, like Inez Barron, long histories in the Black lives, and the, liberation of Black people. Imani Williams, that's now the public advocate. What is a good thing that has happened, and I believe this is, I'd like to see more of, is that we have a new city council in place. And a lot of these folks are younger, newer folks that come from the actual political movement. We've already been to jail together. You're already at that direct action. You were the housing activists that, helped to win that rezoning struggle. You were there in the trenches with the people. So people voted for you. And so these folks have been the ones that, largely women of color, that people already trust and know. We've been very clear, especially like the elders in our communities. If they don't know you, they don't know where you came from. Maybe this is not the person to vote for. If younger people are like, yeah, well, this person says they're born and raised in this neighborhood, we have a lot of that, and that we don't have any history with them. But it's about taking another look. So that's been something. That sort of the progressive movement has been like, how do we push for actual activists? How do we push for actual people on the ground in our neighborhoods who already have track records, are being on the right side of history to be in these elected positions? And so that's been that was a strategy last year to get people into office this year that came from an activist background and that we already knew and loved, and that we already knew what they were about. So again, I'm like, if come from the people, be on the ground with the people, that's what makes better policymakers.
Councilwoman Castillo, you serve in office. What's your advice to fellow elected officials, and also you have been a community organizer, to fellow community organizers?
Yes, absolutely. Participation in boards and commissions are instrumental, especially here in San Antonio. For example, the Building and Standards Board, who has the judicial authority to vote to demolish a structure, a home, whether it's occupied or not, can do that without council consideration. And I understand there is erosion of trust within the political process, and rightfully so. But there are these boards and commissions where there's opportunity for community to help shape policy before it makes it to city council, to potentially vote to preserve someone's house and connect them to services, to emergency funds, so that way they can rehab their home rather than demolish it. And these are key pieces that here in San Antonio, and I'm sure in other cities, right, these boards and commissions, and sometimes, right, depending on how vocal you are, right, the council member may not appoint you, but there's still opportunity to try and make your way into those and to help shape things. And I would also add accountability to elected officials, right? Ensuring that folks who are saying all the right things and have that rhetoric are being watched and held accountable when they shift away from those goals and priorities, because that's extremely dangerous when you're talking up a good game, but you turn around and vote in the opposite direction. That's very violent to working families. And I know that's something that community is already doing and has been doing, but I'm always in support of holding folks accountable when we're in these positions where we're supposed to be supporting everyone and working families throughout the city. For elected officials, I would suggest recognizing again that all these fights are interconnected, and that while we're having this fight for housing affordability and sustainability, that we need to continue to support and prioritize fair labor standards as well as livable wages for our workers, to ensure that as these property taxes increase and rents increase, wages also increase to help keep our families afloat.
We're already over time, but Professor Bates, I want to ask just you one last question, 30 seconds, for folks who are interested in learning more and delving into the issue of gentrification and displacement, and also boosting mobility. Maybe you could just recommend some resources.
Sure. I would definitely suggest the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley, which I've been affiliated with. And you can find a lot of tools and research to think about how to map and measure and understand urban change, and think about some different tools for affecting that, as well as evictions study. It's evictions.study. which talks a lot about evictions as a way that people are getting displaced, as other folks have talked about, particularly in gentrifying neighborhoods, and sort of looking for some of the research that's out there. Thankfully, there's a lot more now than there has been in the past, trying to lift up community-oriented solutions to these persistent problems.
Thank you, Professor Bates. Thank you to Councilwoman Castillo. Thanks, Kamau Franklin, and to Imani Keith Henry for lending your insight and your perspective today to an issue that communities across our country are grappling with. My hope is that some of the folks who have an opportunity to watch this program are inspired to redouble their efforts in their own communities to try and create greater equity, to push back on policies that hurt vulnerable low-income communities of color, and instead become champions for those communities, or continue in their effective representation for those communities, and look at striking all of the balances that we have to strike as policymakers to ensure that everyone is able to prosper in the communities that we live in. I want to thank all the panelists, not just for being with us today, but for the tremendous work that they have done, that they are doing, and that I have no doubt they're going to continue to do to ensure that everyone is able to lead a good quality of life in those communities they're working in and studying and representing. And finally, thank you to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for sponsoring this webinar. It's been a pleasure to do these two on how we can do things differently in our country to benefit low-income communities of color at this critical juncture in our nation's history. Thanks for joining us.